Matt, I know we're a minute over. I know more people, as everyone knows, our Clubhouse is pretty flexible. People join in and out as they can. So should we go ahead and kick
I
it
think
off?
so. That sounds great.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and we look forward to this first of our Real World Data, Real World Evidence Club weekly discussions, Real World Wednesdays discussions here on Clubhouse, the first of the new year. And thank you everyone for joining, and hope everyone had a great holiday season over the last couple of weeks since our last discussion. Matt, well, I'll turn to you for additional welcome, and then we can go into introductions.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here in 2022. Excited to kick off a new year. Lots of exciting topics in store for the year. And super excited about luminary Dr. Steve Labkoff, who is joining us today. Extensive background in registries and just a really interesting career and background. I can't wait for the audience to get to know you, Steve, a little bit more. And as usual, this is intended to be a conversation with the audience. So as people would like to just raise their hand, and we'll welcome you to the stage. Love to make it very interactive with questions, and that will basically set the stage for a very dynamic conversation. Keep in mind, being that it is informal, we always like to encourage people to just, again, come forward, think of yourselves as just meeting with friends. We'll keep it very conversational. And as Aaron and I always do, we'll keep it to a strict 1 hour. We'll adjourn promptly at the top of the following hour, just being mindful of people's schedules, the fact that they have pre-existing commitments. And so with that, Steve, let me turn to you and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt. May I add something real quick to our welcome and then go?
Please.
Sorry to interrupt. But just a quick reminder for everyone, and most of you already know this. For those of you who don't, have replays turned on, so it's recording actively. I still hope that many of you, if not all of you, are able to still join, participate. I just wanted to let the audience know that. And then those will be available in future re-listening or even sharing who weren't able to make it live, who want to the discussion.
And Aaron, you were breaking up just a little bit there. I've actually gotten several reports from folks that there's some audio issues today. Some folks can't hear anything. So let's try to address that here.
How's my audio now, Matt? Is this better?
That sounds good, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
breaking up and getting all staticky for a bit.
Yeah, I turned my Wi-Fi off. Hopefully that helps fix the issue. For those who didn't hear, then in the meantime, Matt, hopefully the audio is working better for everyone. And all I was just announcing was the fact that we have replays on, or the recording feature on, for future re-listening for those who weren't able to make it today. And as you are able to join in, just wanted to make sure the audience knew that. But hopefully the audio is working better. And Steve, why don't we go ahead and turn to you for to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thanks very much, gentlemen. I'm Steve Labkoff. I'm the global head of healthcare and clinical informatics for a consultancy called Quantori. I most recently was the chief data officer at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, which is where I got and cut my teeth on Registry Science for the last 3+ years. I've got a long history in life sciences at places like Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and some consultancies along the way at Deloitte, and an informatics firm called Intelligent Medical Objects, which works in ontologies and vocabularies. I come to this whole space after a really rich career in looking at secondary uses of healthcare data from a lot of different perspectives, and I'm really pleased to be here today.
Perfect, Steve. Thanks, and again, welcome. And maybe I think as usual, the audience, the feedback that we've gotten over the last year is that people really enjoy getting to know our guests and sort of the background. And would you take a minute just to kind of talk about your journey into the real world data, real world evidence, and obviously today's topic, the registry space? Transition from clinical medicine. What intrigued you about data, evidence generation, registries? How did the career sort of evolve?
Well, it's interesting. Thanks. It evolved, frankly, from when I was actually in practicing medicine. I was one of the geekier residents at the University of Pittsburgh. I actually took out a private loan from Equibank in 1990 to purchase my first laptop computer. The Macs had just come out, and I took a personal loan for $4,000, and for a resident who was only making $25,000 a year, that was a big loan. And I used to carry it around the hospital, and I would tap into University of Pittsburgh's Mars medical record system, and I would be able to download medical records in seconds, not days. Sometimes it would take days to get records back. So when our patients would come into the hospital, I would be able to read up on what was happening in their cases at the very beginning of their admission, as opposed to a day or two into their admission, which back in that period of time was very, very novel. I also started to, when I was a resident, full-blown resident, I used to have my interns, feed me numbers, and I would create these massive spreadsheets and carry them around and make massive flowcharts to look for different types of trends in labs that were being generated when I was on service at the VA or at Presbyterian Hospital. The reason being was it occurred to me that if you could look at the data in a visual way, you could see trends that others probably wouldn't see. And it became very common at the VA, especially, where I would watch on a daily or a couple days basis that the hemoglobins would start to drift down. I would tell the intern, go stick your finger up that vet's butt and look for blood. And sure enough, in more often cases than not, they would find a GI bleed, and we were able to do something about it instead of wait for the patient to actually have a catastrophic bleed. And it was sort of in those days that it occurred to me that there's many answers in touching patients and putting your stethoscope on them and doing a physical exam, but there's also a lot of power in looking at the data that created as they go through their journey through the hospital. When I left clinical medicine after doing cardiology, which was really rich in data, and did a postdoc at medical informatics at Harvard and MIT, where I actually concentrated on how to bring medical record information to the fingertips of patients using, not patients, to doctors using handheld computers. And in fact, I actually started the first company that actually took medical textbooks and ported them to small handheld computers on the Apple Newton platform back in those days, which now that company actually still exists. It's called Skyscape, and they sell medical textbooks to this very day using the great grandchild of the apps I wrote as part of our. It was called the Constellation Project back in 1994. Joined Pfizer after the fellowship and started doing all kinds of work with data and understanding how to present it back to doctors. In fact, I wrote the first software that was ever in a CVS Minute Clinic. Pfizer and CVS created these three little prototype Minute Clinics that were inside of pharmacies in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Philadelphia, and one other location. And I wrote the software to collect all the data that the patients were bringing in to the nurses there. And then we created reports and sent those reports back to the clinicians who were the primary care docs for those patients to ensure that they were kept in the loop about what was going on with their patients. All throughout my career, I mean, I don't want to go through everything line by line, but I've always had this fascination with what the data can tell you and what it can't tell you, frankly, because it cuts both ways. And in 2006, I partnered up with the American Medical Informatics Association and some colleagues back at Harvard, and we crafted the first set of meetings at a national level on the secondary uses of healthcare data, how it can be used, protected, kept private, and that led, after 2 years, to hearings at Health and Human Services and eventually some publications from HHS that put out the first guidance on data use for secondary data use from healthcare data. Fast forward to today, the work I did at the MMRF sort of brought all those different experiences together to build out the largest patient registry ever in myeloma. That project is up and running to this day and is striving to recruit 5,000 patients with myeloma and string together their electronic medical records data, their proteomic data, their genomic data. Basically, they're going to string together matched sets of data on 5 vectors and have a 360-degree view of the patient's journey through myeloma with an eye towards trying to help find new cures for the disease. So that's sort of the long and the short of the trajectory I've taken.
Steve, everything you said resonates a lot with me. A couple of things. One is I can share, similar stories. I think many of us who kind of did a transition from clinical medicine into medical informatics were kind of the geeky fellows within our, classes and residency programs. In 2003-4, I was trying to use a tablet to pull up images from our PACS system in real time as we walked around and around it with patients. I will say, and there are people even in the audience here that I really love hearing the historical kind of reference that, like you just made. Charlie, I'm looking at you as well in the audience. I love hearing it from you guys because I think it really helps with that last point that you said. As we think about the evolution of how healthcare data has been generated, is generated today, especially in the context of what we've been referring to around real world data or secondary use of many of these data. We'll get into patient registries here really quickly, but one thing I wanted to note, or actually I guess 2 things I wanted to note about your pathway. So Steve, I'm not even totally sure you know all of this, but there are a few different points in my own career path where you've influenced my path before we even really knew each other, including a panel you were on in 2007 at AMIA that I remember distinctly. Some things you said about working in informatics and industry that influenced how I thought about transitioning from academics into industry or from clinical medicine in industry, but also the article that you helped lead when your time at Pfizer. For those of you in the audience who don't know, an article published in 2008 in the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association around the opportunities for EHR data to support business functions in pharmaceutical industry. And when I was first starting in 2008 at Roche in Genentech, I really looked at your article as being a significant guide to the many ways in which we might use what we're now all continuing to push forward around real world data. And so thank you again for a lot of the work that you've done for our field and our industry.
Thanks. That paper was literally a seminal paper from my perspective because it was the first time anybody outlined many of the things that people kind of take for granted today. I did that work. I was really fortunate at the time that I had started a group at Pfizer called the Healthcare Informatics Group, and it was staffed with folks like Ross Martin and David Isom and Jennifer Wolfe and Michael Cantor. And it was really a bit ahead of its time. That group's focus was not just on, it wasn't actually even on how to sell drugs, which is what Pfizer's main business was. It was on what are the long and short-term impacts of informatics on the pharmaceutical industry, and were there things that the industry needed to understand or look at or prepare for as things like electronic medical records started to come online and e-prescribing came online and the birth of RIOs came online. All those things, that's what our group focused in on at a very large level. That led to the paper because we started seeing all this work happening around data becoming so important, and we were dancing around all these issues and nobody knew answers, so we thought we would codify it all, put it in that paper. And that all came out kind of concurrently with the work we did at AMIA on secondary data use, and that's what I referred to earlier in the conversation. So all this historical stuff is, it's led to things like being able to stand up, multi-dimensional, multimodal data set for cancer research in ways that back then could never have happened. So thanks for bringing up that paper.
Yeah, and no doubt. And I think, Steve, something that's really relevant to these discussions that we have every week, that also, for me at least in my own career, really this paper helped enlighten for me, is in addition to listing the potential use cases, but separate from that was the fact that you guys wrote the paper, that you had recognized, and for me, that helped lead my own thought process around how much we can collaborate on these kinds of methods in a non-competitive way. and I even heard people like you mentioned, Michael Cantor, some other folks that we've worked together with, like John Kai and others, be very, even Craig Lipset out of Pfizer, be very open with the fact that pharma companies can compete on the drugs they're developing, but we don't need to compete on these kinds of use cases and methodologies. We can collaborate on these things. And I think that paper helped kind of shed some light on that for me as well.
Thank you for that. I think that it was recognized by my team at the time that things like data standards and all of the things that you just mentioned. Not only should we we shouldn't collaborate because it's a good idea. We should collaborate because it was not something that any one organization needed or should own. It's kind of like why Odyssey got started, or OMOP. Our group was actually instrumental in helping OMOP get off the ground. I was one of the representatives from Pfizer on that very first committee when we sat down in Washington at the Reagan-Udall Foundation to get that whole thing going. Because things like standards, like the OMOP common data model and everything in that vector, has its roots in being able to find common ways of doing analysis and common ways of using the data. So anything along those vectors is really mission critical to allowing everybody to do the best science they can to bring new therapies to the table.
Well, Steve, great background. Just to hear your experiences and how it shaped you, how it shaped others. Aaron, shining example. This has been fantastic. Let's turn now to registries more specifically, and because of the fact that this is kind of a general Clubhouse room, obviously, emphasis in real world data and evidence generation, but maybe we could level set. And would you mind just sort of defining what a patient registry is?
Sure, and I won't use my definition. I'll use the definition from the AHRQ book by Richard Glicklick and Nancy Dreyer and Michelle Levy. That was the last publication, came out in, I believe, it's the 4th edition. I can't find the date. September 2020, not that long ago. So they define registries as, let's see here. Registries are classified according to how their populations are defined. For example, product registries include patients who have been exposed to biopharmaceutical products or medical devices. Health services registries consist of patients who have common procedures or clinical encounters or hospitalization. Disease or condition registries are defined by patients having the same diagnosis, such as cystic fibrosis or heart failure. All of these different types of registries are brought together by this very similar areas around longitudinality and very hyper-focused data collection and hyper-focused curation. So you generate high-quality longitudinal data on whatever the topic happens to be, and then do so, lather, rinse, repeat, and do it over and over and over again. If you read through this entire book that they've put out, and it's full of helpful hints, it really outlines how each of these different types of registries can be brought up and what it's good for, and then how to do things like the nits of it, like patient recruitment, and how do you handle things like consent and all the nits under the covers to make these things possible, because there's tons and tons of those nits.
That's great, Stephen. Thanks for sharing that. I've thought of that as a reference as well. One of the things that I liked in there was how they outlined a bit on the different kinds of registries, but also the uses of them. So in your personal experience, having worked in this space, and I know we'll get more into that, some of your work recently around the building, establishing a patient registry, an important one. Kind of generally, how do you think about the kind of primary ways in which registries are best used?
So I think it goes back to my early days at the VA. Unless you're able to look at the temporality of information in a holistic way, many times things happen in timeframes that just people can't see or understand. As Aaron, I think I'm an avid photographer, and one of the areas of photography that I work in, and it never occurred to me until just this very minute, it's time-lapse photography. And the reason that I am so interested in time-lapse photography is the identical reason that I'm interested in registries, because a time-lapse image can consolidate down an event that might take minutes, days, or weeks into seconds. And the human ability to perceive things can't always see subtle changes that happen over time. If you consolidate the information down in a time-lapse photography clip or video clip, all of a sudden you can see things like the motions of clouds or how plants grow, things that you just never bring into your mind. Now, when you look at a registry, the point of the registry is to do exactly the same thing. It's to consolidate down events and bring them into focus so you can find that GI bleed in the vet, because over the course of one day or one hemoglobin reading, you're never going to catch it. But if you look at a trend over the course of 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, you'll absolutely notice a drift of 1 or 2 grams of hemoglobin. And that's the same thing as looking at a time-lapse video and seeing the clouds move. And the more you're able to understand how time plays a role in the healthcare journey, and how that takes, how that take what happens over those periods of time and bring them into focus, that is really what the whole reason for building a registry actually is, in my mind at least.
Yeah, perfect. Well, and with that, sort of building a little bit further, you've got very practical experience, as you noted at the outset, for those who have just joined. You came from the Multiple Myeloma Foundation, where you were intimately involved in setting up registries. And maybe, Steve, you could just sort of talk about some of the key considerations, some of the, from your personal experience, some of the things that really need to be factored and considered.
Yeah, so the first thing that needs to be thought through is there's science involved with it. There's also philosophy involved with it. And one of the philosophical things that you have to get into your head as you're going to get onto one of these journeys is that you need to have a plan, because when you start a registry, it's counterproductive to change it radically along the way. What you're trying to strive for from a philosophical approach is like for like data. You'd like to be able to collect similar information across you know, similar kinds of patients with similar disease, and then most importantly, lather, rinse, repeat, do it over time. So in other words, ideally, you'd want to collect and think through a data dictionary for your system that will have staying power, that you won't need to change it, 3 years in. Because as you try to do the analysis of your data, if you make that change 3 years in, not all patients are going to be able to have all the data that you're trying to collect, because the change you make at 3 years in may not promulgate backwards in time, and you may lose that. You'll end up cutting your cohort potential down to whatever that cohort number happens to be that includes that new change. So thinking long and hard with the experts in the field, and that's one of the things we had at the MMRF. We had myeloma experts who put together with informaticians a what we thought would be a long-standing data dictionary, which was basically, what are those fields, what are those pieces of information that you want and or need and believe will be the same data needed in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years to collect along the way. And it turns out that's a real interesting thought exercise, because when you come into things like and somebody wrote a paper on some nomogram for classifying myeloma in, let's say 2015. Well, somebody wrote a similar paper in 2005, and somebody else wrote a similar paper in 1995. Which one of those metrics are you going to use, and can you actually get it? There's a European version of how to classify myeloma. There's a US version, and my point is that you need to think through all of those types of issues a priori and do as comprehensive a job as you possibly can. And you also need to be judicious about what you're trying to collect. You don't want to boil the ocean. I happen to be in contact with folks at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Their registry contains more than 2,000 fields, and they've been running it for 40 years. They have actually made changes to their registry over time, with very good reason. There's been medical advances, new drugs, and as a result, they don't have the same patients over those 40 years, but they do have cohorts of patients that they can look at over that period of time from different points of different time frames over the course of that registry. So those are just some of the considerations. Thinking through your data dictionary, thinking through the timing, and what data you're going to need for the long haul.
Steve, that resonates a lot with me. It reminds me of conversations we have, again, thinking back on when I first entered the field, working at Russian Genentech, in parallel to some of that work that was happening at Tufts University as they were assessing the way in which clinical trials are run across the industry. And one of the things that we did as a part of submitting some information, in fact, Jane Miles was in the room, I don't see her now, but we worked together on that back, I guess, 14 years ago. One of the things we looked at was, in the context of clinical trials at least, what percentage of the data we collected that actually ended up being analyzed. And it was a little surprising, maybe to me, somewhat naively at the time, that there was a pretty decent chunk of data that never got analyzed. Like, we would include them in our studies because of trying to, I think, maybe future-proof, maybe even somewhat not having good reasons, but just collecting the data. And so I wondered, like, with the issue you're bringing up right now, I can imagine there's a tough balance there where you're trying to, like, anticipate your data needs now and in the future, and how, you know, healthcare will naturally evolve and might impact that, while at the same time, you know, probably wanting to balance it better. Or maybe that's not an issue anymore. Is it even an issue where you have to also want to balance out and say, well, you know, we don't necessarily need to collect everything. I don't know.
Actually, you're spot on. And it not only is an issue, but it's a really challenging issue. Because here's the thing of it. We have the balance there really is a, if you're trying to say, I want to collect all the information possible at every myeloma patient, you know, a myeloma patient's medical record chart is going to be, if it was printed on paper, is going to be inches and inches thick. They go through transplants, they go through multiple lines of therapy, they go through all kinds of things. All of those things are needed, but to your point, Aaron, they're not all needed to the same level of granularity. And figuring out what you want to look at and save becomes super important. We ended up looking and saving roughly 200 fields for the MMRF of data points that we were looking at. Some of them are obvious, like what drugs they were on, what were the timeframes for those drugs. Others not so much, which would be like ECOG scores. And then there were things that I was alluding to before about diagnostic staging. And the staging of myeloma, like many cancers, over time tends to drift because someone will come up with a better model of what the stages look like. And by the way, if the stages were based on clinical findings versus maybe genomic findings, you know, then there's a whole different thing. It's not about the storage capacity, frankly. And I think there might be people thinking out there that, oh, you know, storage is cheap, we can get whatever we want. It's about being able to not lose sight of the forest for the trees. If you collect way too much information, sometimes it makes it difficult to sort of dive in and understand what you're looking at. And, you know, if I do a time-lapse photograph of a flower in bloom, I don't want to take a time-lapse of an entire field of flowers because I will absolutely miss, you know, all the subtle changes that are happening in an individual flower. So that balance is what has to be thought through. And this is why organizations that don't start, like I was talking about, by really thinking through that dictionary exercise early on and do it with medical experts and informaticians at the table, will likely make mistakes and either save too much or too little or not the right information. And then that will diminish the long-term value of what they're trying to build.
Great insights yet again, Steve. Thanks. Let's just take a moment to kind of reset the room. That is, just highlight, excuse me, for those that have joined. great discussion with Dr. Steve Labkoff, who's the global head of clinical and healthcare informatics at the consulting firm Quantori. Very distinguished background in informatics, pharma industry. Most recently left the Multiple Myeloma Foundation for research, and also learned that you're an avid photographer. So that's something we have in common, Steve. With that, love to turn to some additional challenges in terms of registries, and maybe from the design. Obviously, the elements that are actually captured, that's a critical consideration. Other thoughts around just key considerations and sort of trying to, in the absence of a crystal ball, get it right from a planning perspective?
Well, yeah, thanks. One of the things that really got us badly on the Cure Cloud registry was the level of complexity that was involved in data collection and patient engagement. And you wouldn't think there'd be a lot of complexity there, because what do you need? You need a patient to say, yes, I want to participate, and I'll give you my medical records, and I'll give you a tube of blood, and on their way they go. Well, it turns out that just creating an engagement strategy for how to get patients to become aware of it is a major undertaking. And by the way, that undertaking is not necessarily undertaken best by informaticians. That we did at the MMRF. We did that in conjunction with firms, with marketing firms, actually, because getting a patient to participate in a registry is no different than any other ask of somebody or any other consumer. You need to find them. You need to make sure they understand what's being asked of them. There's the additional layer of informed consent that has to be done, and it all has to be done at the level of perhaps the 8th grade reading level, or maybe the 4th grade reading level, and I'm not making that up, so that patients can understand what it is they're getting involved in. And when you start dissecting the various pieces of each stage of registry development, things like that are not obvious in terms of how hard they can be to pull off. And having a thoughtful engagement strategy will ensure that you get enough patients that you want with the disease of focus. Sometimes patients are very eager to participate. If there's like with MMRF, the cancer registry, patients are looking for cures. They're desperate, in fact, to find cures. But what if your child is born with some disease? Maybe you stay involved when they turn 6. Maybe you don't. What's super important is you want to make sure that they do stay involved from maybe birth to maybe 18. Well, that's a really long time to keep people engaged, and you need to think through, how are you going to give something to those people, those patients, their parents, whatever, that will encourage them to stay involved. And it sounds like it might be an easy thing, a no-brainer, but I will tell you that that's one of the hardest parts of the entire exercise. How to keep people's interest and how to keep them coming back, so you can make sure you have the longitudinal information that you want. What good is a registry if a patient drops out after a couple of years? I mean, unless of course they're dying, in which case that's an endpoint, and you need to explore that. But if they're not dying and they just vanish off the face of the earth, that makes it really diminishes the value of what you're trying to accomplish. So, if people are listening or contemplating registries, thinking through that engagement strategy is really, really super important. And Matt, I apologize, I've lost track of the second part of your question.
No, that was fine. It was really just some of the additional challenges. You've been speaking from personal experience. I love the thoughtful consideration around just how to keep people interested, and that probably would lead into a whole Clubhouse discussion by itself. I can envision in the future things like gamification and sort of the latest thinking around just engagement in general. Love to have future conversation on that. But maybe, Aaron, I'll turn to you just with a reminder to the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand, icon down at the bottom of your phones, and love to bring you to the stage. Welcome your question. We'll make it more of a dialogue, and look forward to, thank you, Sheila. Welcome up to the stage. And Aaron, why don't you pose a quick question, then we'll turn to Sheila's question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks. And I was going to reiterate that as well. I know that there are a few people in the audience who will have experiences similar to what Steve was just talking about around the challenges with running prospective studies in general. So I am looking at some of you in the audience. Please kind of join in, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. And Steve, I guess I'll just kind of add a little to your thoughts just now around and reiterate one of your comments around the fact that it's not really a medical informatics challenge per se, or a lot of these challenges aren't. It reminds me of the chair of my medical informatics department when I first started the informatics program at the University of Utah, who was Reed Gardner. And I know a few people might know who that is in the audience, but many of you might not. Well-respected, well-known medical informaticist in the field, and passed away a few years ago or so. But I had the opportunity to train under him for a little bit, and he would constantly remind us how often healthcare technology-related issues were only 20% technical and 80% social, political, et cetera. You could fill in the gap there with all the other issues around how healthcare IT can be implemented. And what I'm hearing you talk about is the same thing, these kind of non-technical challenges that then I would say we would then turn to and say, well, how might we implement technology to help overcome some of those as well?
Yeah.
Not sure if you have anything to add there. Yeah.
Well, I will add that, I knew Reed Gardner as well, and may he rest in peace. He was one of the luminaries of the field. And, it's that piece of advice is that's one of those things you call a pearl, because it takes a really smart informatician to be at a table like this when you're planning something like this and saying, that's not not in my world, but it is in the world of what we're trying to do, and we need to solve it, and to bring the awareness of the problem to the table so that others around the table who may have that expertise can focus in on it. But knowing that it needs to be that the problem is not a technology problem is almost as important as knowing that it is, and knowing when to pull the right strings to make things happen or not happen. So that's a great insight.
Oh, perfect. Sheila, let's turn to your question. Want to be mindful of the time and encourage other questions. Please feel free to raise your hand. Sheila, over to you.
Sure. Hi, Matt. Hi, Aaron and Steven. Thank you so much, Matt. I think you and I had a teleconference planned at one point, and I will. One of my follow-ups from listening in today is to get back in touch with your admin and get on your calendar, because definitely would like to talk with you offline. I really appreciate this. I'm not a RWE specialist myself, although I find it very interesting. I have two questions. One of them is a question. One of them is more of a thought that I wanted to share. And I'm not sure. I think it was Steve. You were talking about. You had the metaphor of if you want to do a time released flower, you're not gonna look at the entire field, because you're going to miss the detail. What I find interesting about that is the fact that data collection is best done when you start with the actual question in mind. And yet the data that we're collecting today, whatever it might be, there's a temporal component to it, meaning that we don't yet know the questions that we want to ask of the data. And so that's kind of almost a philosophical issue, but it just kind of an interesting thing that struck me. And I think that's true of patient data. I think that's true of data science in general. And just wanted to share that thought. The other thing, the question that I have is, in RWE, what are you guys seeing with respect to blockchain? And I'm going to go on mute because my dogs want to pipe in. Do you see anything with use of the blockchain, and are there any movers and shakers with respect to that?
So thanks for the comment and the question. So I'm going to go back to what you said at the beginning. Knowing what the question is going to dictate what the technology solution may need to be brought to bear, what may need to be brought to bear. So do I know of companies that are using blockchain and real world evidence? The answer is probably yes, but it's going to have to, they would only bring it to bear for a use case where that was necessary. And, you know, in some spaces, you need validation of events and to make sure they haven't changed or they've been audited properly. So in areas where there are data collections that are really, really sensitive, that you need to ensure that they are being done once and only once, and documenting a very pristine audit trail, that's an area where I think something like blockchain technology can be brought to bear. I wouldn't bring blockchain to bear for, you know, the myeloma registry, for example, because none of the data we were collecting nor the questions we were trying to answer really required that degree of auditability and that degree of rigor. And secondly, most of the data we were collecting, with the exception of the genomic and immunologic data, was retrospective data from electronic records that were being abstracted from medical charts. So what's the sense in putting that in the blockchain? Because number one, it's already out there, and number two, I'm not really sure what that would provide an additional, uh, what that would add to it. I'd be interested if like Charlie Barr might want to chime in on this one. Charlie's in the audience out there. Charlie may have some other perspectives on the blockchain, and Charlie's actually one of my peers and one of Aaron's peers. We trained together. Well, not at the same time. We trained at the same location in Boston many years back, and Charlie and I have remained friends for long, long times. Charlie, can you maybe get on the stage and chime in on
Yeah,
that one?
no, it's a good question, Sheila, and I think Steve, you nailed it. Basically, the blockchain is a technology in search of a problem, or a solution in search of a problem, and you really have to have the problem space where it's needed, because it brings with it a lot of complexity and overhead. And I think we're still in the process of searching for those instances where it's required and where it's the optimal solution. So I'd say we're still in a journey to find those clear use cases and scenarios where it's required. And most of the time, as Steve said, I'd agree with you. I'm hard pressed to identify clear examples.
Well, and I think, Sheila, just to come back to you, and it's a fantastic question, and yet another topic for a full Clubhouse discussion at some point. But I love it. What are some of your thoughts? I mean, are you engaging industry? Are you having questions around blockchain as it pertains to registries specifically, or do you have a vision for something that requires the sort of the immutable, unchangeable capabilities and features of a blockchain?
Not specifically, and certainly not specific to patient registries. I come from a long line of software development, life sciences R&D software development, mostly in reg and ClinOps. And the promise of blockchain is to liberate us all liberate the data from proprietary software systems. At least that's one of the promises of blockchain. And so I don't have enough knowledge or vision to really see its applications in real world evidence in general. But I think that's, and furthermore, I think we're in the dawn of a transformation, hopefully blockchain enabled transformation that will allow interoperability. I mean, how long we've been talking about interoperability all across the drug development spectrum for 20 years, and nobody has achieved it. And we still just build these data silos and data silos and data silos that don't speak to each other. And the data silos are specific to certain functions, i.e., very specific questions that we're asking, whether they be operational in nature or analytical in nature, but it's still a data silo. So I'm just kind of throwing it out there, to the extent that this is sort of a thought leadership forum, and you guys are very, very interesting. And I thought I'd throw an interesting thought out there. It's a hope, certainly not something that I have seen realized just maybe a dear hope close to my heart.
This is Steve. Let me just chime in on something you said there. I've been railing for interoperability for a really long time in my career. And while I completely agree with you that interoperability is an absolute essential, and we've been sort of crawling our way towards there, the introduction of the US CDI, the Common Data Set for Interoperability, happened last year. Things like that are going to make more inroads than I think blockchain's going to. Blockchain, to my mind at least, is more for certifying that data is that A equals A and that nobody's messed with it. And in a clinical trial setting, that might be really important for data collection. You put the data collected record into the blockchain, and that way you know for sure that nobody's messed with it and it's always as it was. But for terms of straight up interoperability, I think more work needs to be done on things like the OMOP Common Data Model or the USCDI, and finding interoperability languages that proprietary medical record systems don't use their own terminologies and things like that. That's where we're going to get to interoperability. I think blockchain might come along for the ride in some of that, but I don't think it's the most critical part of that equation. I think the work that's being done at HL7 and other places that really will. The problem is that there's money in chaos, and there's a lot of people making a lot of money on the fact that the interoperability doesn't exist, no matter how painful it is. It's a fact. The analogy would be like in the old days of the railroads, they used to have different gauges of trains, and they'd get to a hub between different railroads, and they'd have to unload and load the trains again for goods to get them onto a different rail system that had different gauge of track. Well, that's pretty much the same thing that's happening now, and there's companies that are propped up that actually live and thrive on the fact that there is no interoperability. So there's competing interests at stake here, and unfortunately, the patient's left on the cutting room floor because it's in the patient's best interest to have everybody be able to read their data. And unfortunately, it's taken more than 20 years, almost 20 years since the ONC started, and it's only made the slightest incremental change. So I just don't. I agree with you, but I don't agree with you that blockchain's the answer for that.
Great point,
Well,
Steve.
if
Sheila,
I
please.
could. Yeah, I just wanted to say, Steve, I don't know if you made the point or Charlie did, but actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, that pretty much brings us full circle to the comment that was made about it's 20% technology and 80% social. I think you're entirely right. The low-hanging fruit is in creating meaningful standards and driving adoption of those standards. And that you're right. It's not simply a technology solution. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure.
And Steve, let me just echo the enthusiasm for data standards. And of course, Aaron and I are very passionate about that. We've had that as full club room discussions in the past, and will in 2022 as well. So very, very important topic.
Yeah, and unfortunately, standard setting takes a really long time. It takes the most smartest people in the country and the world to set those standards. But more importantly, you got to get people to adopt them. So I know that folks like the MITRE Corporation have worked on things like M-Code. And if you dig deep, M-Code was meant to be a new standard for nomenclature around oncology. The question isn't is M-Code a good idea? M-Code's a great idea. The question is, how do you get people to use it? And how do you get people to adopt the use of the standards? And this is that 80% that Reed Gardner pointed out. That's not an informatics problem. We've got to be able to figure out ways that we can squeeze common sense into the world. And right now, if you haven't noticed, common sense isn't exactly at premium.
Yeah, I had to laugh out loud on that one, Steve, as I was coming off mute.
I did too.
I agree. I think it is interesting. I might say, rather than, and I wonder if this is the evolution of our field, rather than saying it's not an informatics problem, we might say, well, if the informatics problems have evolved beyond technological issues. And therefore, as informaticists, we have a broader perspective or responsibility than just the technology side of it. And I might say also that, to this discussion, and Sheila, thank you so much for bringing it up, because I like how you brought it around, Steve, too. Well, what's the issue and what are we trying to solve? If the issue is implementation, there may be different technologies that are the right fit for helping solve those issues, whether it's blockchain or not. And it's very easy as newish, let's say, technologies kind of become more aware in the industry. I try to at least remind myself of the hype curve and thinking about, well, where do we think this might be on that hype curve? Are we still trying to figure out where it's going to land and where it's the best fit? And there are a number of technologies like blockchain, fire, etc. I mean, we can name a bunch that we have to kind of see, well, where are they a best fit? And they may or may not be the solution for, for everything, for sure. But Sheila, I did want to come back to something you brought up in your questions. And your second question was about blockchain, but I want to come back to your first thing, because I think that was quite relevant to some of the stuff you were bringing up, Steve, and Charlie would love your thoughts on this as well. As Sheila, as you were kind of saying how it, one of the challenges related to what you're bringing up earlier, Steve, was around anticipating what you're going to need to ask of the data, and how we don't always know all the questions, up front. We try to anticipate that, but undoubtedly down the road, and I think this is particularly relevant for patient registries that are going to be running for many years, down the road, we're going to come up with new questions we need to ask that we had not anticipated. And so what I might ask is, from your perspective, Steve, as you built registries and thinking about that, how do you handle when a new question kind of comes up where you might not have actually collected or defined your data dictionary appropriate to that question? And how do you make that pivot, midstream?
Yeah, it's a very, very tough question to field, because the minute you deviate from your initial data dictionary, that means that in some query somewhere, someone's going to ask the question, and you will be cut back to the point where you only started to collect that new piece of information. It's not a decision that should be taken in a vacuum by just the informatics team. It should be a piece of information taken into consideration with the scientists who are on the program, and frankly, even the folks who are doing patient engagement. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because at MMRF, as the example I'll use here, one of the things that we were giving back to patients as part of the engagement plan was a view to the macro view of patients in the registry. So we were giving back data visualizations as a gimme, as a what's in it for me. And if we were to have changed some of the data we were collecting, that would imply that some of those visualizations might not be presenting the full length of time of patients in the system. Now, by the way, if there's a new medical breakthrough and a new drug comes on the market, of course you need to include that in the registry. But what I'm saying is that it's not a binary decision. It's a decision that needs to be really thought about because of the long-term knock-on effects. This concept of time that we've been sort of skirting around with regards to registries is really the critical factor here. I'm going to go back to the time-lapse photography as the example. If you're taking a time-lapse photograph of a flower in bloom, and after 3 days, you move the flower or you move the camera, all of a sudden your point of view on that subject is going to change for the rest of the data collection, the rest of the photographs. And if you string all those individual frames together to make the clip, you'll notice a jarring change in the time-lapse clip as it's being shown. Same thing with the registry. And sometimes it's essential, sometimes you must do it, but you need to do it in consultation with everybody who's in the governance board of the registry, because it will have knock-on effects, and sometimes you can't even understand what those knock-on effects are going to be. So it's not a don't do it, it's a do it with caution and do it with consultation.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Steve. And Charlie, I want to look to you with the same, question, and to just quickly paraphrase. It's, how have you seen in your experiences? I know you have your own, years of experience running and managing a team of that's overlooked registries. How have you seen this kind of issue handled when a new question or Steve, you brought up a good point, or new treatments, or maybe we could say new diagnostic methods, or something new has changed in the healthcare environment that impacts the way you would ask questions or the way you might collect the data in your registry?
Yeah, no, you're all right. It's a very important question and can be difficult. I think there's a couple things to think about to help frame it, at least. And one is the fact that registries can be looked at as a study, collecting a cohort of patients, as Steve noted, where there's comparable patients that meet some criteria and possibly control groups or not, depending on the purpose of the study. So in essence, it could be viewed as a one-time or a defined period of time to run the registry. In other settings, it could be viewed as a permanent or a long-term study. And in that case, then it could be viewed more as a collection of infrastructure, data collection mechanisms, team, process, et cetera, that is actually tied to the patient community in a more or less permanent way. And at Genentech, we had examples of both, single studies that would run 2 to 5 years, and then others that ran as long as 15 years. And in the case of the one registry that ran 15 years, it was the NRMI registry, National Registry of Myocardial Infarction, and it had 5 different time periods when maybe during that one time period, a certain set of questions and certain objectives were in force. So that was a study, in essence, during that time period. And then it was felt that those questions were answered and it was time to move on to a new frame of questions. And so the data collection changed. And of course, some variables were consistent across most of the 5 time periods. Others were quite different. So I think that sheds some light on why registries are a unique beast, and why there's some potential confusion among different parties as to what they are and who they are. A third point is that when you do a study or have a longer ongoing study, there may be a stakeholder that's funding it or sponsoring it, but there may be a broader community or collaboration of communities that are working together so that they share the common infrastructure and work together to define what are the data standards and the methods for engagement, and that becomes very powerful. And that's been one of my passions, is how we can do these collaboratively and advance the science of doing these kinds of studies, and how do these intersect with clinical trials. So it's a little bit like Steve's analogy of photography and zooming in to focus on the purpose of the particular question or study. So registries can be a broader granularity. Maybe a clinical trial needs to be done at some point to answer a specific question with much greater detail of focus and precision and rigor of analysis. So that's some points to kind of answer that question more broadly.
Yeah, Aaron, I apologize.
Thank you,
I've got to go. It's top of the hour, and I have another meeting I need to go on to. I do want to say thank you for the invitation. Thank you for letting me be your guest on this particular Clubhouse. And I'm available for if anyone wants to have a conversation offline. My email address is Steven.Labkoff, Steven with a V, Steven.Labkoff at Quantori, Quantori, Quantori.com. And I'd be more than happy to resume or have another conversation with anybody from the call. But I need to drop off now, though.
Yep, understood. Thanks,
no
Steve.
problem.
We'll
Thank
let you
you
go.
very much.
Wonderful discussion. We'd like to thank the audience as well. And Sheila, great question. Charlie, thanks for your contribution as usual. Wonderful insights. But look forward to next week, Real World Wednesday, with the Real World Evidence, Real World Data Club here on Clubhouse. And thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
And a quick reminder, and I know people are dropping off, but I would encourage people to go check out Steve Labkoff's profile on LinkedIn. He has a great post related to the photography that he's referenced. So please go check him out. Thanks, everyone.